Iconography and meaning. Okay, iconography is the study of symbols within representations to understand the meaning of a work of art. So, for example, it would be identifying a man on a cross wearing a crown of thorns as Jesus. To do this, we might focus on a specific element within a work. So, for example, taking Poussin's dance to the music of time, we might focus on this figure here, two-headed figure, and identify that as Janus, or we might focus on this element here, a winged old man, and identify him as time. Alternatively to that, we might look at an image as a whole. So, for example, having a look at Fra Angelico's 1440 image of the Annunciation. So iconography is identifying the symbols and the subject. Iconology is something different. Iconology is understanding why that image, that narrative, in that way, at that time. What explains, for example, Fra Angelico's interpretation of the Annunciation in 1440 and Dante Gabriel Rossetti's interpretation of the same scene from 1849. This idea about there being identifiable motifs within works of art has a long history that stretches back to Pliny. In his Natural History, he includes subject matter in his descriptions about works of art, suggesting that he thought that was important. We have many texts that articulate how emperors and empresses are to be depicted, what their iconographic attributes are. Similarly with religious figures, how does one identify or depict a particular saint and differentiate them from another? It's not just about people. In the medieval period, there were things called bestiaries, which were large texts that included real, imagined, and exotic animals like that little guy there, and then attached to those different figures like unicorns and horses and fish, a particular Christian virtue or meaning. Then those would be used by artists when they were composing works. In the 16th century, those texts that were initially sort of intended for artists and craftsmen extended in their audience and reach, and connoisseurs would consult those as well. In the 18th century, an individual called Johann Winkelmann laid the foundation for a very systematic approach to ancient art and the identification of motifs and symbols within ancient art, ancient Greek and Roman art, so for example, gods and goddesses. But the father of iconography is Erwin Panofsky, and his teacher was Aby Warburg. Aby Warburg really mistrusted formal analyses. He argued that art was connected to its religious, philosophical, scientific, political, economic context, and that there were underlying meanings and narratives within works that could be understood. It is Panofsky who really devises a kind of three-step process for unpicking what that underlying meaning is. There are three stages to what Panofsky suggests we do. Number one, recognize the components in a work of art. So here I can see there is a baby, a little owl, a young woman, an old woman, a skeleton holding a sand timer, an hourglass. That would be stage one. The idea is you don't really need any information, any cultural background to be able to do stage one. Stage two would be to attach those components to a known narrative. Looking at this, I can identify it as the three ages of man and death. So it's a symbolic interpretation of life in the constant presence of death, who's holding this hourglass. The third stage would be to understand what is this image, what's the intrinsic meaning of this? What did it mean in 1539 to its audience? What does it tell us about German humanism? What does it tell us about early 16th century ideas relating to death, life, magic, and witchcraft. For Panofsky doesn't throw out formal qualities. He's interested in those. He said that the formal qualities and the content could not be separated. He said that our job as art historians was to understand the underlying principles that reveal a basic attitude of a nation, a period, or a class, or a religion, or a political persuasion, and how all of those things, he argued, are condensed within a single work of art. He did make it clear that in looking at images, we need to be alert to the culturally specific use of pictorial traditions and symbols that influence how we understand what we see. It's also true that it's completely possible that other individuals would not connect this to the 3 stages of man. So we ourselves bring our own cultural expectations. It also has its own cultural context. And part of the job of the art historian is to bridge those 2 things. Of course, there are a number of presuppositions with this method, right? Thing number 1, it assumes, or it takes for granted, that all works of art are a tool for communication, albeit in code. Number 2, it suggests that art making is rational, that these things are all completely thought through and deliberately included the way that they are. Number 3, meaning is static. Number 4, that this theory, which was based on works like this, Botticelli's Birth of Venus, Panofsky comes up with this method by looking at Italian Renaissance art. Part of the presupposition is that the method that works for this can work for everything. Can it work, I ask you? For this, Max Ernst's The Attirement of the Bride from 1940. Some scholars in particular have criticised this technique and highlighted some of the problems in it. So some people have said, for example, that we cannot apply this theory to all works of art. A good example would be Dutch genre scenes from the Golden Age. This is an example of a Dutch genre scene. It's by Jan Steen, dates to 1664, and it's called The Christening Feast. So some scholars have said that some scholars have used Panofsky's iconographic approach to discuss depictions like this of everyday life and everyday objects and claim that they are full of allegories, full of symbolic meaning. Not all scholars agree. Svetlana Alpers, for example, has argued that these scenes are not narrative or symbolic. Rather, they are connected to a very specific Dutch visual culture that is about knowing the world rather than concealing the world, which of course is in part what symbols do. It's possible, of course, that works like this are both symbolic and part of Dutch visual culture and knowing the world. The last thing this kind of theory implies is that an artist or a patron has complete control, can dictate the message that's being communicated in a work of art. This is a really interesting premise. Individuals like Roland Barthes and Derrida, 2 philosophers of the 20th century, would likely disagree with this. Roland Barthes announced the death of the author. He was a literary critic, announced the death of the author in 1966. He believed that the creator of texts or a work of art should not have a monopoly over its interpretation and that other readings were equally tenable. For Panofsky, an image like this contains individual motifs that can help us understand the particular time and the particular context of the Netherlands in 1653. Someone like Roland Barthes would say that Willem Kalf, who painted this still life with lobster, drinking horn and glasses, does not finish the image, but rather it is you, the viewer, who play a role and are free to have your own interpretation, and that your interpretation, my interpretation, and Willem Kalf's interpretation are all equally tenable. For someone like Derrida, he wrote in The Truth of Painting in 1978 that it is impossible for us to secure a meaning within a cultural discourse. Meaning, for Derrida, was in a constant process of evolution because signs are only provisional, they are temporary. And therefore the best that we can do when we do a kind of iconographic analysis is talk around a subject, talk around what it might mean. But this idea that Panofsky had, that there is an intrinsic meaning and that by performing a series of steps we're able to understand it, that Derrida would disagree with. I've included here on the last slide some prompts that you might like to consider when we think about iconography and meaning. This is a question that you might answer in relation to Baroque works of art from the Dutch Golden Age, from the Italian Baroque, but there are also works from the 19th and 20th century that are appropriate for a discussion about meaning and how meaning is communicated. Images, artists who spring to mind are individuals like Dali, who had his own personal iconography, and Georgia O'Keeffe, again, who had a repertoire, an iconography that was particular to herself and her own situation. I hope that helps.